Hello.
Hey, gang. Okay, let's get the obvious thing out of the way. This isn't American Truck Simulator. We do have American Truck Simulator. We are going to do some episodes in American Truck Simulator. My truck isn't moving.
Yeah, thanks to the benefactor.
There we go. Yes. My friend Jay bought me American
sent us
Truck
American Truck Simulator, and we will do that. But we haven't grinded enough, so we can only go on very short trips.
Yes, indeed.
At this point, which is not conducive to the format. So we are in Brussels instead.
Yes.
Or as the game calls it, Brussels.
And we are taking cottage cheese.
We are taking an enormous quantity of cottage cheese. 18 tons of cottage cheese.
Truck
if you can wrap your head around
What's
that.
What's it look like? Nice and secure in there.
Yeah.
It doesn't look airtight, but I assume there are airtight.
I would have thought there would be a tank, a tanker, like a milk tanker full of cottage cheese.
That would have been terrific, but no.
You could just take a normal milk tanker and kind of wait, and then it would become a tanker full of cottage cheese.
I like Europe.
I do too. Like the American version has some advantages, i.e., we could be, hey, look, I recognize that.
Yeah.
But
it's in California, my home state, but we'll talk about that when we actually start playing.
So what are we going to talk about today?
It's a bit of a shame that we're not in America, actually, because our subject today is the most distinctly American form of theater.
Yes.
Professional wrestling.
Oh, there you go. I think that most people would say a Broadway musical would be the most distinctively American form of theater. Also,
would be wrong.
Professional wrestling is held international, too.
It is a worldwide thing, but there's a distinctly American idiom within it, I think. I'm not the expert here. Maybe I'm wrong.
I am indeed. I mean, it's like...
Oh, fuck.
The reason that we have chosen... Whoops!
I think I've unbound my engine retarder.
Oh, God.
So
that sounds terrible. Do you think you'll be able to survive this despite that? Or?
Yeah, I think we'll be fine. I just need to break early.
Cool. The reason that we're talking about this is that I've been sort of stuck in a professional wrestling hole for the last... month, maybe? You know how I get.
Yeah.
You guys know how I get. I am prey to sudden carnivorous interests which come over me. This is not a new one for me. It's been around since I was in high school, but like in very intermittent fashion. So it sprang upon me, sort of unbidden. And while we could be talking about video games, there's a bunch of new video games to talk about.
There are wrestling video games out there in the world.
It's true, although the most recent ones have not been particularly well received. We could be talking about XCOM 2. We could be talking about The Witness.
We'll probably talk about those things.
We could talk about The Beginner's Guide.
There's no reason to be talking about The Beginner's Guide.
Go to my blog for a very, very rude little article about The Beginner's Guide. But instead we're going to talk about professional wrestling. And I think what the form of this, because I'm the expert...
I want to hear the scoop.
...is going to take is a lecture. So strap yourselves in, ladies and gentlemen.
I have some questions I can ask, but I'll let you take it away at first.
Okay, so first of all, the question that is unfortunately the first question that one often has to field in these instances is not professional wrestling fake? To which the answer is yes.
Surely most people are over this by now.
Well, it may be a bit of a hangover, but like when I see, when I go to wrestling videos on YouTube, there's always one guy in the comment section who's like, "This is obviously fake."
You all know,
as if this was news to anybody.
Right?
Why do you care about this? Because but the question also has some ramifications, right? Because yes, the contests are predetermined, and yes, the people are not actually doing those moves to each other, obviously, because A, those moves require the cooperation of two people to pull off, and B, if they were not done in a safe manner, people's necks would be broken all the time. But the thing about it is that it is also like a really athletically demanding thing to do. Mm-hmm. And it is not a particularly safe thing to do, because every time you do one of those moves, you are trusting the other person involved in that move not to break your neck, essentially. So there are a lot of wrestlers who get injured. There are particularly an enormous number of injured wrestlers right now. The World Wrestling Entertainment, which I'm going to call the WWF because that's what I grew up with.
It's the World Wrestling Entertainment?
It's called World Wrestling Entertainment. It's not called the World Wrestling Federation anymore because the World Wildlife Fund successfully sued them, in case anybody didn't know.
WWF has always felt more correct, but I always thought it was the World Wrestling Enterprise. I didn't realize they docked off the
It's
definite article.
just World Wrestling Entertainment.
World Wrestling.
Because, and we'll get into this a little bit later, the focus of World Wrestling Entertainment is on sports entertainment,
Right.
not on wrestling, which is a point of contention for some. Anywho, so people get injured, people get hurt, and a lot of wrestlers die early from substance abuse addictions, from problems brought on by long-term steroid use, and just because it's a really difficult. It's like any sport, you age out of it, and these people are not paid well enough to
Ignore that. It won't do it again. You don't have to throw it away.
These people are not paid well enough to make good financial decisions over the course of their careers, and so many of them, and the biggest game in town doesn't take care of its alumni very well, and so a lot of people end up in really bad situations.
So you're saying that there is a brawny heroism to these big muscle men?
Yeah, I suppose that's pretty straight, not particularly surprising.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, there's a sort of distinct romance to it, and as a world, it has its own logic, it has its own language, it has its own creative style, which is not quite like anything else, and variations on that creative style, a number of different creative approaches to what wrestling is and could be, different styles of physical wrestling, and a very complicated sort of meta relationship with its fans. So it's really fascinating because of the way in which it is fictional, the way in which it is fake is super interesting.
Yes.
So
That's true. No, I agree. It's always struck me that my take on this, and perhaps it's way off base, but my take has always been that the thing you're seeing dramatized in professional wrestling is the actual inner workings of the business. Like, in a way, what you're seeing represents real things. It's as if, for Rihanna to get a number one single, she would have to release a Beyonce diss track. You see what I'm saying?
Right. I mean, which happens sometimes.
Well, yes, but it ain't as codified as it is in wrestling, and that seems to create some interesting value. It makes the drama not completely, imaginary.
Yeah, and there are different creative forces in wrestling who have chosen to play up that particular aspect of it,
Right.
and creative forces who don't. So just to sort of to give some groundwork,
Yeah.
in wrestling there are faces and heels.
Mm-hmm.
As a wrestling promoter, you want people to be cheering the faces and booing the heels. Indifference is the worst possible thing.
Mm-hmm.
Having your faces be booed is very bad because that means that you're not able to successfully sell a hero, and having your heels be cheered means that you probably need to turn that person face because you have fucked up at making a villain. Whether this dichotomy actually works anymore in this day and age where nobody, as you said, everybody knows that wrestling is fake,
Sure.
is an open question. And there are people who you see sort of breaking away from the classic heel-face sort of dichotomy. And there have always been people who have sort of experimented with it, but that's the general format. There will always be a heel and a face so that everybody knows who to cheer for.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that they get heat, which is crowd reaction.
Yeah.
That's sort of the way that you measure how successful that you're being. Once again, another thing that as the fans get smarter is less of a reliable metric of what's going on.
Right. You told me the term for a smart fan is a smart mark, and I enjoyed that little speech.
Yeah.
Many years ago.
Or smark.
Smark.
Yeah, no, that's what they're called.
It used to be that people actually believed in wrestling more than they did. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's how this works, right?
Mm-hmm.
So wrestling evolved. Professional wrestling evolved out of carny stuff.
Yeah.
Right. You would have at the carnival an exhibition show of strength, last 5 minutes in the ring with the great mutilator, and he would, the guy would go and mangle 3 people at once, and then a guy would stand up in the crowd and be like, I'll do it, and the carnies would take bets, could this guy be the great mutilator? And it turned, and they would get a lot of bets, and of course he can't.
Right.
And then it would turn out the guy was a plant, and the mutilator would lay down for him, and the carnies would clean up.
Uh-huh.
But that kind of shit, right? So there's this tradition, and a lot of the lingo like dates back from days of like just organized flimflammery, which is one of the reasons why the audience are called marks, i.e.
Right.
suckers.
Right.
And back in the day, it was not publicly acknowledged that it was, or it's still not publicly acknowledged that it's fake, but you know, most people who weren't really paying attention didn't really twig to the fact that it was all fixed. To the point where where wrestling promotions would have problems with like local authorities and local governments who was like, you can't hit a guy with a chair in an athletics contest, you know, and like people, you know, particularly overzealous like athletics commissioners for counties would come in and try to get them shut down and stuff, and people would have to take them aside. It's like, it's not real, you know. And this practice of keeping it all on the down low is called kayfabe.
Whoa, what's that? What is the etymology of kayfabe?
Well, if you think about your Pig Latin, it's pretty close to fake, right?
Oh God. It's all kayfabe.
It's all kayfabe, right?
Jesus.
And so, like, and you didn't expose the business, right? You didn't break kayfabe, which means that if you were a heel, you didn't, you know, even when you weren't in the ring, you weren't going to go around like shaking people's hands and signing autographs. You were going to be mean and vicious and cruel and nasty to anybody who you happen to meet in the territory that you're working in.
Wow. Because
you're a heel, you know.
Yeah.
You know, you don't sell merch with the heel's face on it, you know.
Yeah.
And so this is the way that it was pretty much until the internet happened. There were always smart marks, you know, people who knew the business and were like familiar with it and reading on that level, but they formed sort of the minority of the audience. And the audience was also more diverse then, you know. Pro wrestling these days is mostly a thing for you know, the 20-something male demographic.
From Florida.
From Florida. But back in the day, there was way more women because this was a lot of very attractive shirtless men bouncing around. You know, there's a sort of natural connection there, and pro wrestling hadn't worked to alienate them on every possible conceivable level like they have these days. You know, so, and it was sort of also kind of like a thing you would take your family to, you know?
Yeah.
So the professional wrestling business changed a lot in the 90s, in the late 90s and like around
with the rise of
90s.
UPN.
Well, let me take you through it. So this is sort of the history of professional wrestling in this country.
Right.
There used to be a lot of little, and there still are, a lot of tiny little wrestling companies dotted around the country, and they would have their own stable of workers, which is what wrestlers are called, workers. But then people would travel from promotion to promotion, and like do little acts and little storylines that were designed. You know, here's this guy from out of town. Is he going to be a hero from out of town? Is he going to be a villain from out of town? You know, you'd work their little promotion, and then, you know, when you came back the next year, people would remember that, and you would like continue the feud or whatever connection that you had back there.
Right.
And all of these promotions had bookers, and the job of a booker is to decide who's going to win and who's going to lose in an attempt to, and who's going to have various titles, like who's going to be the champion, in an attempt to get the most bums on seats. Like, it's like it takes sports, and then it takes the thing that is the problem with sports, which is that since it is relatively, you know, you can't always be sure that you're going to get the most satisfying result from sports.
Right.
You know, like the big team that everybody hates might just like keep winning because they happen to be the best team, you know, which is unsatisfying, or all that stuff. So booking takes the guesswork out of it and just tries to do things in a way that is going to make sure that every time is like super good sports moment time.
Yeah.
By making the most dramatically satisfying thing possible, and then you would, how good a wrestler you were, like just in terms of your physical wrestling, might have some bearing on, you know, how you were pushed, but, you know, it was also how good were you on the mic, you know, how tight you were with the guys backstage, whether you were reliable, whether you would show up, whether you were drunk, you know. And so all of that factored into who the booker would make champion, who the bookers would make win and make lose. And you would have individual feuds between guys, and then they would you would blow off the feud. You know, there would be the big match at the end of the feud where the good guy wins, then the bad guy would leave town and go to the next promotion. That kind of thing. Vince McMahon is a very important name in wrestling. He ran one of these small promotions in New York, or in the Northeast. I don't remember the name of the. I don't remember the name of the first promotion that he had, but his father was in the business, and his father before him had been a fight promoter.
Okay.
And just gradually over the years, the WWWF, which is what the WWF used to be called.
What did that all stand for?
I think it was Worldwide Wrestling Federation or something along those lines. They gradually grew, and they started absorbing, talent from other federations, and they got on TV, which was not just local TV, which local promotions have been on local TV forever. Back in Chicago, there used to be wrestling on TV 4 nights out of the week.
Yeah.
Back in the 50s and 60s. The World Wrestling Federation got on the national TV bandwagon before anyone else did. And the World Wrestling Federation got on the pay-per-view bandwagon before anybody else did. And they were the first people to make national celebrities out of professional wrestlers. And the big star of the WWF was Hulk Hogan.
I remember him.
Yeah. And so what is called the golden age of professional wrestling was in the late 80s, early 90s. This was the World Wrestling Federation had consolidated itself. It was this big promotion. There were a lot of other, smaller promotions sort of vying for this position. And something called the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. But the important thing was that was the big thing. And this was Saturday morning cartoon central, because that was what the culture was at that time. Hulk Hogan was incredibly wholesome, eat your Wheaties kind of guy. And you had characters like Randy Savage, the Macho Man, is who you should know, and The Undertaker, and Jake the Snake Roberts with his bag of snakes. And all these old, incredibly roided out, huge fuckers who were big in the industry. Were who did all this, fun stuff.
Yeah.
And that
everyone knows the cream of the crop.
The cream. Oh yeah, brother. Randy Savage is one of the best human beings. I will stick to that. But anyway, so that was the state of affairs, and that was the first real moment when professional wrestling had a nationwide audience. Now the downside of this is that professional wrestling as a nationwide thing was controlled by Vince McMahon, who is insane, who is
he's still in charge, right?
Yeah, no, he's absolutely still in charge. He will not be not in charge until he dies. He is in his 70s. He's incredibly buff. He just loves this business very, very much. So that was the state of affairs then. Then there were a couple of things happened. There was a steroid scandal where it was not certain whether Vince McMahon would end up going to jail. And a bunch of people had to leave because of that. WCW was started, and that is Ted Turner, the billionaire media mogul who saw an opportunity to make this a 2-person show and started hiring away people from the WWF to make there be a competition. And so the WWF went into a decline. Most of the big names of the golden era left for WCW because they were able to give them better deals, and because dealing with Vince McMahon is insane. And so there was kind of a dark period in the mid-90s where wrestling was pretty shitty. And then...
Even over in the WCW, it was shitty?
Well, the WCW had its own problems. There's so much to get into here, right?
Yeah.
You were talking earlier about the sort of, the booking in the ring mirrors the politics of the business, mirrors, this sort of thing. The guy who was in charge of WCW, Eric Bischoff, loved that kind of shit.
Uh-huh.
And he premiered the practice of doing shoot interviews. And shoot is like means the opposite of kayfabe. It can mean both shoot fighting in the ring, like if you see, there are some wrestling matches that become real because one of the guys pissed the other guy off in some way, and those punches start actually landing. And it's really obvious when it happens. Or if you handle somebody badly and they don't like it, then they might start working a little stiff, as they say. Or there's shoot promos where instead of doing your sort of storyline thing, the boss gives you the mic and says, just say what you really think.
I can see how without a certain dramatic suspension of disbelief, so to speak, like this whole thing could fall apart and become less appealing. Is that about right?
Well, it's one of those things where it's like there's an excitement to feeling. I mean, the whole point, and people will dispute what the whole point of pro wrestling is.
Sure.
But the whole point of pro wrestling is it's fake, but you kind of feel like maybe there's something there anyway. These guys are struggling with each other so well that there are some real stakes to what is happening, even if they aren't the same stakes that they're telling you.
Sure.
There's some actual stakes to this match. And one way to do that is to exploit people's real life drama with each other, to try to generate the heat between them that makes the crowd invested in their rivalry and their fighting and their feud.
Yeah.
The problem with that then is that you are encouraging a lot of guys who do not maybe have the best emotional intelligence in the world to actively fight each other backstage, which is going to be bad for your business overall, particularly if you, the boss, are also part of that. And the thing that WWF and WCW both found pretty much at the same time was that the best and most reliable way that they could keep generating heat was to take the owner of the company or the boss of the company, the owner in Vince McMahon's case, or the boss in Eric Bischoff's case, put them on stage and make them villains.
Yeah.
Make them like despicable, rich, egomaniacs. And of course, there's a little bit of truth to that.
Sure.
A lot of truth to that in some cases. But playing on that was the best, and using, and thus having the evil boss create impossible situations for the hero wrestlers to try to overcome, was a goose that kept laying golden eggs for them for a very long time.
Right.
The problem with it, the way that Eric Bischoff handled this on WCW, was that the problems that he was highlighting were real.
Yeah.
The WCW's big claim to fame was that they had Hulk Hogan turn heel. They made him into a villain, Hollywood Hogan, and that worked great for a little while. But the problem is that he basically was able. He was so central to that organization that he was able to call his own shots, and he kind of ran everything into the ground as a result.
Yeah.
Something similar happened in WWF with Shawn Michaels, but not to the same extent, because Shawn Michaels is not the name that Hulk Hogan is. You probably have never heard of Shawn Michaels, unless you're a wrestling fan.
Jay, who bought us American Truck Simulator, happens to be a wrestling fan.
Hey Jay, the Heartbreak Kid, the Click, a notorious collection of mid-90s backstage assholes in the WWF, who contributed to the decline of the business in that period.
So it sounds like what you want from these larger than life figures is for them to be battling over larger than life issues rather than
and there's a real variance to what those issues can be, because with any angle, which is the name for a sort of storyline or the way that it. So there's a gimmick. There are gimmicks, which are characters that wrestlers have, and then there's angles, which is the storylines essentially. The angles, you just need to find one reason for one person to want to fight another person, and that over the years has ranged from he stole my jacket. There was a wrestler in WWF who was legitimately the grandson of a pirate, and they gave him a pirate character, and he started stealing things from other Wrestlers because he was a pirate and he stole Bret Hart's jacket, and that made Bret Hart angry.
Did they engage in a match while the pirate was wearing the stolen jacket?
Yes.
That's perfect.
It can range from that to you brutally beat up my friend.
Yeah.
To you slept with my wife or girlfriend. Lot of manager / girlfriend jealousy and swapping around. To you literally killed my dog.
Hopefully no animals were actually harmed.
No, but the kayfabe killed, certainly. Oh god, there's some really amazing ones over the course of the years, but you get the idea.
Sure.
The most heinous acts that you can imagine, down to the most minor stuff. And those gimmicks range from things that seem really realistic to things which like the Undertaker was literally an undead hell priest for a long time.
Yeah.
And it was a storyline that he died and came back.
Right. I vaguely remember that.
Yeah,
I remember seeing the promos for that after Star Trek Voyager, I think.
Yeah. SmackDown on UPN, and that was during the Ministry of Darkness, where they strap people to crosses and sacrifice them.
Oh my god!
But that coexisted at the same time with Steve Austin, whose gimmick was that he was a angry drunken Texan, essentially, who hated everyone, and who became the biggest star in the WWE, or F as it was at that point, off the back of that. You had in the mid 90s was a particularly bad moment for gimmicks, but in the mid 90s you had wrestling garbage men, Duke the Dumpster Droese, you had wrestling dentists, Dr. Isaac Yankem, DDS, wrestling hillbillies, wrestling people from the Outback, fitness gurus, everything anybody could think of, but then also vampires,
Yeah.
So there's no, since you're already breaking, playing with reality, there's just you can get really weird with it. Yeah. And whether people enjoy that or whether people enjoy things that are more realistic is sort of an ongoing point of contention in both wrestling fans and wrestling creative. Yeah, exactly, a little bit of both. Or there's stuff that is played for comedy because wrestling is slapstick versus stuff that is played as if it's actually hurting somebody. And depending on the context, the exact same move can mean nothing, or it can be devastating depending on whether it's somebody's finisher or not, where in the match it happens. It's all about the gesture is so much less than the than the meaning that is attached to the gesture.
Yeah.
And there are some wrestling writers who have gotten so far into this that they want it to be all gesture, but people don't actually watch it unless the wrestling itself is decent.
I had never considered that wrestling writers were a thing.
Well, here's the thing, right? So cranky old folks from back in the day are, they deride sports entertainment. They want to return to wrestling bookers instead of wrestling writers. Wrestling bookers who say who's going to win, who's going to lose.
Right. But the performance is more of an improv sort of.
The performance is more left to the they give the wrestlers a gimmick and they see if they can work in the gimmick and they try to.
I can see how that would be appealing if you can see it done masterfully.
Oh yeah, no, I mean there's some bookers who are really, really great at what they did.
So some of that is still around.
Yeah, but not in the big, not in WWE certainly. WWE has writers who who write promos and give them to the people and say something that's like this, trying to memorize it. And they write out all the storylines and all of this stuff. Because it's sports entertainment,
right?
And the WWE brand meshes with their reality show about the women, which is called Total Divas.
Oh dear.
And don't get me started about fucking women in the WWE. It's so tragic. And brand awareness and what words you can and can't use. You can't say the word wrestlers. On WWE, they're superstars.
Oh my god, you can't say wrestlers.
You don't say women. They're all divas, not women. there are people whose names have been written out of WWE history because of horrible things that they did, and you can never mention their names. You can never mention, what they were or who they did. I mean, yes. Which actually in some cases don't mention who they did. Jerry Lawler. So there's this sort of whole gestalt going on.
Right.
In smaller organizations, there are still booking wrestling, and then there are things like Lucha Underground, which is a new show that is made in seasons, and the whole thing is shot and then aired, and there are whole interarching storylines that are entirely written out, and there's no pretense being made that this is actually an athletic contest. It's a TV show.
Mm-hmm.
And the old school people hate that.
Right.
But the smart fans really like it.
Interesting.
And so there's this point of the smart fans and the old school purists, who are people who, generally are people who used to work for the WWE but don't anymore. Jim Cornette is the most famous of these dudes.
It sounds like for me, I feel like this permeable membrane of reality would be a part of the appeal here, and I can see myself being disappointed by a more traditional television presentation.
Yeah, it's. I mean, part of what I became a wrestling fan during what is generally considered to be the peak of pro wrestling in terms of its popularity, which is what is called the Attitude Era now, where because of the ratings war between WWE and WCW, they both just kept trying to top each other and make things more outrageous and bizarre and extreme. And this led to some fantastic stuff and led to some horrible stuff, and I lapped it up. This led to a storyline in which a man who had been hired on a very long-term contract by the WWE because he was supposed to be an Olympic weightlifter, and he was supposed to go win his medals and then come and wrestle for the WWE for years. Didn't do very well in Olympics, but they still had him, and they had him on a really long-term contract, so he was bouncing around forever, and he would sometimes have a monster gimmick where he was the world's strongest man, and he would sometimes have different gimmicks. And during the Attitude Era, he was sexual chocolate Mark Henry.
Oh my god.
And there was a storyline in which he made love to and impregnated a 70-year-old former women's champion from the golden age of wrestling, and she ended up giving birth to a hand.
Christ.
So
like a living hand, like an Addams Family sort of.
No, we didn't go quite that far. There was, I remember very memorably, the stable of horrifically racist Japanese wrestlers threatening to, and almost the camera cut off just at the moment, but almost cutting off the penis of the porn star gimmick wrestler. They had a catchphrase that was so racist that I don't think I can even bring myself to repeat it. But this was also the era that gave us The Rock and Steve Austin and Mankind, and generally be the most famous and lucrative wrestling stuff that's ever been, because everybody was trying absolutely everything.
Yes,
and
I remember when, speaking of UPN, I remember when The Rock wrestled 7 of 9.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing, right? And there's something to be. What is that chugging? You wouldn't think it would do that, would you?
I think it's probably partially a result of the fact that I accidentally did this in 1080p. Blah 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 blah. Don't worry about it.
Okay, whatever. But yeah, no, it's the. It really is just sort of the thing that appealed to me in the first hand was there's such potential here, right in this sort of. In this collision of reality and fakeness. It's Borgesian. It genuinely is Borgesian.
I'm the one who's supposed to say that when it's wildly inappropriate to do so.
I just beating you to it.
I wasn't going to say that. I was, what it reminds me of, and I generally agree with you, this seems like a an outlier as a cultural staple in the kinds of instincts it appeals to. But what it reminds me of, and forgive me if this is a bit obvious a comparison, but it reminds me of those antique notions of theater, right? Where it was a place to go and get rowdy and see some outrageous things happen.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's
that's
super...
something we've largely turned away from as a culture. And in fact, like that little factoid about how Shakespearean theater used to be that is often used as a cheap way to attempt to cheapen Shakespeare's legacy and say, well, really, he's just this kind of thing. But
right.
But no,
bread and circuses.
Yeah, I think there's something very compelling about that.
Yeah, it's a tradition that we don't really have in America anymore. Like after vaudeville went away, Britain still sort of has it in pantomime. Those weird sort of children's Christmas shows with all the audience interaction and stuff.
Yeah.
But this sort of like, big live performances with like immediate reactions with fans thing, and sort of this weird point of whether it's real or not,
right,
is and a subculture around it is very, it seems like it comes from another era.
And it's also like the only place where there's like these characters are very similar in a way to like serial heroes of like action films or adventure films. They're these massive dramatis personae upon whom you can rest your hopes and dreams. Except
they haven't been that for a very long time.
Oh,
as
really?
A general matter.
Is that true?
I mean, the Hulk Hogan was that.
Yeah.
And McMahon kept trying to make more Hogans. He kept trying to build somebody else up as like the great American hero.
So what are they now?
Well, the Attitude Era changed a lot of things. The fact that Steve Austin was the most famous wrestler in the world and he was just an ornery Texan asshole, basically.
Well, people see something in that, don't they? Don't they?
Well, yeah. Well, it is. I'm just saying that like the reason that wrestling has been able to stay current is that these archetypes shift.
Yes.
The things that people latch onto. I mean, there's certainly like maybe it would be better to draw a line between the Shadow and the Undertaker. The sort of like mystical, maybe has superpowers, maybe doesn't sort of idea.
Right.
It's not this, but you're right. It's not the same as professional wrestlers. This is stuff like the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. This is like Jack Quartermain.
The other thing I was gonna say is that like to whatever extent they resemble action characters, one thing that's definitely true is that this is a genre of character which hasn't become pathologized, which has been a trend in the last couple decades. Like it or hate it, James Bond is now all about his inner demons, and so is everybody else. And that unless I'm wildly mistaken, has never happened and could never happen to professional wrestlers.
Oh, there have been plenty of professional wrestlers whose gimmicks have revolved around them being crazy.
Oh, yes,
but it's played to make them seem more powerful,
right?
Not to make them weak,
right? It's not about what does it feel like to be one of these people. It's not about the subtle torture of the day-to-day life.
Subtle is definitely not the right word, but like Mankind, Mick Foley was his character was all about like the backstory that Mick came up for his character was that he had. So Mick Foley came to the World Wrestling Federation. They told him that he was going to wear a mask and be sort of this deranged character, and they gave him a list of possible names for this character, which really are really, really great, and I would recommend that we, maybe put a link to that or something. But they were going to call him like Manson the Mutilator, or Eric Eargon because he only had one ear.
But he said, "No, I'm a metaphor."
No. He said, "I will be called Mankind." And my backstory will be that I was a piano prodigy, and that I played piano so beautifully that it made my mother weep, but I misinterpreted her weeping for pain, and so I smashed my own hands so that I can never play piano again.
Okay, but there is some psychodrama there, but that's like some...
No. Well, like you said, I know what you're saying. This isn't about... I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it's not a difference in subject matter. It's a difference in approach.
Yes. Okay.
Action movies are, all about America and, America's weakness or America's strength. And it's like, in pro wrestling, there's the foreign heel, and the foreign good guy. And then occasionally when the mood in America is such that having a super patriotic dude as a hero doesn't really jibe with where we are, the super patriotic guy is played as a chump,
right?
But since everything eventually boils down to hero or villain, face or heel, there's no real nuance to it, and it's just like there have been racist villains,
right.
But definitely also racist heroes.
Yes.
Depending on it's all down to the mood of the country and like reflected in the most blatant possible terms. Or would be ideally if it didn't also have to be filtered through Vince McMahon's crazy head.
He is the idiom at this point, though, right? Like, it wouldn't be the same.
Well, there are plenty of places to get wrestling that aren't the WWE if you are a wrestling fan, serious wrestling fan.
But his crazy filter has become a kind of comfortingly familiar system of symbols, I suppose.
Absolutely, certainly for American pro wrestling. Mm-hmm. I mean, Mexican pro wrestling has a very different sort of set of ideas. Japanese pro wrestling has a different set of ideas. British pro wrestling has a slightly different set of ideas.
Can't even imagine.
And of course, this is all heavily influenced by what American pro wrestling has come up with, right? There's still different styles and approaches. Like Japan likes less of the nonsense and more like really hard hitting stuff, although that's being changed now. And the Mexican stuff is like way more telenovela and way more flying around and doing tricky acrobatics than actually, fighting.
Oh, are we taking the ferry? No, we're not. We're parking right here.
Yep, we are done. So I feel like I've barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot here.
I feel like I've done the basics, and now the stuff that I was going to get to about, the interesting things that are happening right now, in terms of like how, I didn't even finish the story of wrestling, which is that after eventually crushing the competition and WCW shooting down, the WWE basically sort of fell into another stage of decadence, and people feel that it hasn't really recaptured the glory that it had.
What I would like to hear you say in this last minute or so is, I would love to hear you just distill, if you can, very briefly, the appeal of this for you.
Well, part of it is that I enjoy watching large men bounce off of each other because I have a deep and abiding love of slapstick.
Right.
Part of it is that I enjoy the comedy stylings of non-comedians.
Right.
Professional wrestling necessitates because the things that you need to be a pro wrestler. You need to be an athlete. You need to be a dancer. You need to be able to do improv, and you need to be a public speaker. You need to be charismatic. Mm-hmm. There are very, very few people who can actually do all of that. And so what wrestling gives us for the most part is people who are good at one of those and not really good at the others, or people who, muddle along, and like the part of the writing is trying to find ways to accentuate the strengths and hide the weaknesses of various characters. But like, it's all amateur hour. Like, with a couple of exceptions. There are a few real consummate fucking masters of this. Randy Savage was one of them. But, for the most part, The Rock wasn't the greatest wrestler of all time, if you know what I mean. He was good enough.
Right.
And Steve Austin was the total package, but before he even got famous, he broke Owen Hart, I think, broke his neck.
Oh.
And so by the time that he actually became famous, he was a good talker, but he wasn't a great wrestler anymore,
That's tragic.
Yeah, and it's like, so it's really just... and it's live theater. Like, the pay-per-views and like Raw are live, and so it's just watching this cavalcade of people who are really shouldn't succeed for a wide variety of reasons, just occasionally achieving greatness, occasionally achieving these moments of theatrical greatness, and you can't predict when it'll happen because the people who are trying to make it happen are idiots, and when they succeed, it's by accident a lot of the time. And some of the best moments are the ones where people fuck up in ways that are incredibly memorable. Some of the classic promos are like you talk like Steve Austin's. You talk about your John 3:16. Well, Austin 3:16 says, "I just kicked your ass," which lovely line. He came up with it. But like the people who get on the mic and say, "And that's why I kicked your leg out of your leg."
Is that real or
yeah, that's real. That's real.
Oh my god,
that was Owen Hart, or Sid Vicious once in the middle of a live broadcast asked the interviewer if he could start over, or what I'm saying is that it delivers on both the positive end and the negative end.
Yeah.
It delivers both as hilarious camp failure and as these occasional moments of transcendence. And the fans are so angry about how bad it is most of the time that there's also that.
I'm familiar with that.
The crowds have become super meta at this point.
Yeah.
Because it's the people who really care that go to these shows these days.
Right.
And so the chants that the crowds do when the wrestlers wrestle in ways that do not please them these days are like just these huge angry in-jokes, like chanting for people who aren't even in the match, and
wow, this sounds like pretty amazing, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but it's a lot of really horrible shit that you have to wade through in order to get to the stuff that's good.
I've never been able to penetrate it, but I'm glad we have you to. And it's a shame we didn't get into all of it. Maybe we do some kind of addendum. But
maybe you drove very well.
I did
over the course of that because you mostly weren't talking or thinking.
Yeah,
it's amazing how that works.
I think it was an oversized load of cottage cheese too. It was behaving very
so much cottage cheese.
All right, gang.
Well, I hope that was at least interesting, and if you'd like us to talk more about this, I can do that.
Yeah, maybe our next episode is split between more wrestling and The Witness. Yeah. That seems appropriate.
I'll end by saying that my favorite wrestler currently is a man named Kenny Omega, who wrestles in Japan, is a Canadian. His finishing move is the one-winged angel.
What is that?
Yes, that is an overt Final Fantasy reference.
Jesus, the world has moved on.
He's great. We're going to link to a video of him wrestling a 5-year-old girl.
Okay. And maybe at the end I put Werner Herzog talking about how you mustn't avert your eyes from professional wrestling.
Perfect. All right.
Okay, gang. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.